Hey there. Tonight, we're descending into the bowels of Rome, and not the marble halls of senators, but the wet, echoing throat of the Cloaca Maxima. You won't find clean heroes here. No grand speeches or shining myths. Just the reek of stagnant water, the scrape of shovels on brick, a legion of tunnel walkers hardened by disease and darkness, and the unrelenting weight of an empire's waste. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe if it brings you even a sliver of peace. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing who else is drifting off to the slow march through history. Thank you for spending your evening with me. Come back tomorrow for more echoes from the underworld of empires. Now, dim the lights. Let the drip of ancient conduits and the distant rush of hidden rivers warm your mind. Settle in and let's begin with the first stone that dared defy the Tiber. Chapter 1. When rain was a curse, I remember how the floods turned streets into rivers of mud and rotting wheat ankle deep, thick as guilt. Before the great sewers carved their paths beneath Rome, rain was not a blessing from the gods. It was punishment. Each storm transformed the 7 hills into 7 waterfalls, pouring down into the valleys where the poor had built their lives on hope and soft ground. The water had nowhere to go, but through wooden walls, through packed earth floors, through the dreams of families who had thought they were safe. Why did the poorest neighborhoods always drown first? The answer lay in the shape of the land itself, in the way water follows the path of least resistance, just as power does, just as wealth does. The Subura, the Velabrum, the valleys between the hills, these were Rome's catch basins, places where the city's refuse, both human and liquid, naturally collected. I remember the sound of it. Not the dramatic roar you might imagine, but a persistent gurgle, like the city was choking on its own growth. The streets would fill slowly, incrementally, giving people time to move their possessions higher, to climb onto tables, to lift their children above the rising muck. But time was the cruelest gift, because it allowed hope to linger, even as the water rose past ankle, past knee, past the point where escape became impossible. The smell came before the sickness. Standing water in a Mediterranean climate breeds more than mosquitoes. It breeds despair. The sweet stench of decay, the sulfur tang of human waste, the metallic bite of blood from the butcher shops that lined the Forum Boreum. All of it mixing, fermenting, creating a soup that the next rain would only stir and spread. Malaria was not a word they used then, but they knew its face intimately. The fever that came with the floods, the shaking that followed the rains. Children born in the wet seasons carried the pallor of sickness in their skin, the tremor of disease in their growing bones. Mothers learned to read the sky like scripture, watching for the clouds that would bring death wrapped in the promise of clean water. The wealthy, of course, had their solutions. Their villas perched on the high ground of the Palatine and Aventine hills, their courtyards designed to channel rainwater into cisterns and gardens. They watched the flooding from their terraces, oil lamps flickering behind glass windows, their slaves already dispatched to check the foundations and clear the drains that served only them. But even the wealthy could not escape entirely. Disease travels uphill when it travels through water. The same springs that fed their private baths drew from aquifers that touched the contaminated pools below. The same Tiber that carried away their carefully channeled waste also carried back the sickness that bred in stagnation. I remember the failed attempts, the small victories that became great defeats. Wooden drainage channels that rotted within a season. Stone gutters that cracked under the weight of debris and collapsed into the very streets they were meant to protect. Clay pipes that shattered when the ground shifted, creating new springs of filth in places where children played. The Romans were builders, engineers, conquerors of the known world. They could span rivers with stone bridges, carve roads through mountains, raise temples that touched the sky. But water was different. Water was patient. Water was relentless. Water remembered every slope, every crack, every weakness in their grand designs. And so the city festered. Between floods, the streets dried into hard-packed mud mixed with waste, straw, and the detritus of urban life. When the rains came again, they dissolved this crust into a poisonous broth that flowed wherever gravity demanded. The Forum itself, the beating heart of the empire, became a seasonal swamp where senators lifted their togas to wade through puddles that reflected their faces back at them, distorted and stained. The priests offered sacrifices to Terminus, god of boundaries, asking him to keep the waters in their proper places. They burned incense to Jupiter Pluvius, begging him to temper his gifts. But the gods, it seemed, were as helpless as mortals against the simple mathematics of rainfall and topography. Some storms were worse than others. I remember the great flood of... But no, time moves differently when you measure it in disasters. The storms blur together into a single memory of brown water and floating debris, of bodies both human and animal carried along like messages from one district to another. The dogs suffered worst of all. Abandoned by masters who had to choose between saving their children or their animals, packs of them would roam the flooded streets, growing desperate and dangerous. When the waters receded, their carcasses would be everywhere caught in doorways, tangled in the branches of trees, bloated and staring from the mud that hardened around them like primitive statues. Children learned to swim before they learned their letters, not for pleasure, but for survival. Mothers tied ropes around their waists during the rainy season, tethering them to heavy furniture, so that when the water rose, they could pull their families to safety like fishermen hauling in their nets. The city tried to adapt, as cities do. Shopkeepers built their counters higher. Homeowners raised their floors on stilts. The Forum vendors learned to dismantle their stalls quickly, carrying their goods to higher ground when the sky darkened. But adaptation is not solution. It is merely elaborate surrender. And then, slowly, like the dawn of a new age, came a different kind of thinking. Not how to live with the floods, but how to defeat them. Not how to survive the water, but how to command it. Then came the diggers, men who traded sunlight for stone. The great sewer's first breath, the Cloaca Maxima, sighed like a living beast. Her bricks wept constant damp. I remember when they first broke through the old Etruscan drainage channel, widening it, deepening it, transforming it from a simple storm drain into something Rome had never seen before, a throat that could swallow not just rainwater, but everything. The waste of an empire, the refuse of 1,000,000 souls, the dark offerings of civilization itself. How many slaves vanished in her tunnel maw? The question haunted the overseers, who sent men down with ropes and torches, counting them in the morning light, counting fewer when evening came. The earth beneath Rome was hungry, honeycombed with caves and soft spots where Etruscan builders had carved their channels centuries before. When you dig deep enough, long enough, the darkness begins to dig back. The work began at dawn, always at dawn, when the air was coolest and the shadows longest. The slave gangs would gather at the mouth of the old Drena, modest opening near the base of the Palatine Hill that had carried storm runoff for generations. But Rome needed more than storm drainage now. Rome needed to swallow its own growth, to digest the waste of conquest, to process the excrement of empire. Gaius Curius was the magistrate who first envisioned it, though history would remember other names, grander names. He stood at the drain's entrance one morning after a flood, watching the brown water trickle toward the Tiber, and saw not what was, but what could be. A channel wide enough for a man to walk upright, deep enough to carry the contents of every latrine, every kitchen, every workshop in the growing city, permanent enough to outlast the empire that would build it. The Etruscans had left more than just a drainage channel. They had left knowledge. The slaves who worked the expansion were mostly Etruscan, captured in the wars that had brought their cities under Roman rule. They knew the soil, knew the water table, knew which stones would hold against the pressure, and which would crumble like bread in wine. Their knowledge was their slavery, and their slavery was their survival. I remember the ritual sacrifices to Cloaca, goddess of the sewers, goddess of purification through filth. She was Venus transformed, love goddess becomes sanitation deity, beauty finding her purpose in the management of decay. The priests would stand at the tunnel entrance each morning, pouring wine into the flowing water, casting grain into the darkness, asking the goddess to accept their offering and protect the men who would descend into her domain. The slaves learned to read the signs. When rats fled the tunnels in daylight, it meant cave-in was coming. When the water tasted sweeter than usual, it meant they had broken through to a natural spring and must be careful not to contaminate the source. When the air grew thick and hard to breathe, it meant gases were building in the depths, invisible killers that could drop a man without warning. They worked by lamplight, olive oil flames that flickered against the curved walls they were creating. The light carved their shadows into giants, stretching their bent backs and muscled arms across stone surfaces that would never again see the sun. Each man carried his own lamp, his own fragile connection to the world above, his own responsibility for the light that kept the darkness from swallowing him whole. The engineering was simple in concept, revolutionary in execution. Take the natural depression that drained the valley. Make it deeper. Line it with stone. Arch it over with carefully fitted blocks that would distribute the weight of the city above. Create a covered river flowing beneath Rome's feet, invisible to the citizens who would depend on it, accessible only to the men who maintained it. But simplicity in concept becomes complexity in execution when you are working tons of stone in confined spaces, when every block must be cut to fit precisely into curves, calculated by eye and experience rather than by instruments. The Etruscan slaves worked with tools their grandfathers had used, bronze chisels, wooden mallets, ropes woven from hemp and sinew. Each stone was shaped by hand, fitted by touch, tested by the weight of water and time. The tunnel grew slowly, section by section, month by month. Progress was measured not in miles, but in arm lengths, not in days, but in seasons. A good crew might advance 20 feet in a month if the soil was cooperative, if the stones fit properly, if no one died in cave-ins or gas pockets, or the dozen other ways that tunneling could kill. They developed their own language in the depths, a mixture of Latin commands and Etruscan technical terms, Greek mathematical concepts learned from Eastern slaves, and the universal vocabulary of men working together in darkness. Hand signals became as important as words when the sound of flowing water drowned out voices. Touch became as important as sight when lamp oil ran low and shadows ruled the tunnels. The goddess Cloaca watched over them, but she was a demanding deity. Her priests taught that cleanliness was next to godliness, but that someone must handle the unclean for cleanliness to exist. The slaves were that someone sanctified by their servitude, blessed by their willingness to touch what free Romans would not touch, to go where free Romans would not go. I remember the first section that was completed, perhaps 50 feet of arched tunnel, perfectly fitted stone blocks forming a conduit wide enough for two men to pass each other without touching. The water flowed through it like a prayer answered, carrying away the detritus from the streets above, disappearing into the darkness beyond where more tunnels waited to be carved. The celebration was muted. Slaves do not celebrate, they endure, they survive, they continue. But there was satisfaction in the work, pride in the precision, wonder at what human hands could accomplish when guided by necessity and divine favor. They had created something that had never existed before, a permanent solution to the temporary problem of waste. But permanence is a promise that only time can keep. The tunnel they had carved was perfect for its purpose, but its purpose was growing. Rome was growing. The empire was growing. What seemed vast and adequate for the city of their time would seem cramped and insufficient for the city their work would help create. As winter settled over Rome, As the rains began again, and the new tunnel carried away the floodwaters that would have otherwise pooled in the streets, the slave gangs prepared for the next section. Deeper tunnels, wider channels, a network of arteries that would spread beneath the city like roots beneath a tree. The Cloaca Maxima had taken her first breath. Soon she would learn to sing. Aqueducts, dancing with gravity. Frontinus whispered to Rivers. A slope of 1 in 4,000, he'd murmur. A hair's breadth from disaster. I remember Julius Frontinus standing at dawn on the hills outside Rome, his surveying instruments catching the first light, his fingers tracing calculations in the morning dew that gathered on stone tablets. He was Rome's water commissioner, appointed by Nerva to tame the empire's thirst, and he understood something that escaped most men, that water was not conquered, but courted, not commanded, but convinced. Who calculated the first fatal gradient? The question haunts every aqueduct that spans a valley, every channel that carries mountain water across impossible distances to the fountains and baths of the city. Too steep, and the water becomes a destroyer, carving away the very channels meant to contain it. Too shallow, and it stagnates, breeding the diseases that the aqueducts were built to prevent. The mathematics of water flow were not written in books, but carved into the minds of men who spent their lives watching streams, measuring slopes, calculating the precise angle at which water would flow forever without destroying its own path. 2 feet of drop for every 100 feet of distance. This was the sacred ratio, the golden mean of hydraulic engineering, the slope that would allow water to dance with gravity without being consumed by it. Frontinus learned this not from scrolls, but from disasters. I remember the first aqueduct he oversaw as a young engineer, the Aqua Marcia's expansion, where overconfident surveyors had calculated a gradient that seemed perfect on their tablets, but proved catastrophic in practice. The water came down the channel like a cavalry charge, scouring away mortar, undermining foundations, turning precision stonework into rubble that tumbled into the valleys below. The men who died in that collapse were not soldiers facing an enemy's sword, but mathematicians facing the consequences of a miscalculation. Their bodies were found scattered among the broken stones, crushed not by malice, but by the simple physics of moving water encountering poorly planned resistance. Each death was a lesson written in blood and limestone, a correction to the formulas that future engineers would memorize like prayers. The instruments of surveying were sacred objects, the groma with its bronze arms and hanging weights, the chorobates with its water-filled groove for assuring level ground, the bronze rulers marked with divisions, so fine that the width of a hair could make the difference between success and catastrophe. These tools were blessed by priests before each survey, treated with the reverence due to objects that could save or destroy thousands of lives through the precision of their measurements. I remember watching Frontinus teach the young surveyors, passing down knowledge that could not be found in any library, because it lived only in the experience of men who had seen aqueducts succeed and fail. Water remembers, he would tell them, running his finger along the edge of a stone channel. Every scratch in the stone is a memory of flow. Every stain on the wall is a record of flood. Read these signs like you would read an augury, because they tell you what the water will do when winter comes, when summer burns, when the mountain snows melt all at once. The surveying gangs would work for months before the first stone was cut, mapping the territory between mountain springs and city fountains, calculating not just distance but elevation, not just route but resistance. They learned to think like water, to find the path that was neither too direct nor too circuitous, neither too bold nor too timid. The perfect aqueduct was invisible, so well planned that it seemed like a natural feature of the landscape, as inevitable as a river. But rivers are forgiven their floods, their droughts, their changes, of course. Aqueducts were not. An aqueduct that failed was not just engineering defeated, but promise broken, contract with the gods unfulfilled. The citizens who depended on its water would curse not just the builders, but the spirits of the water itself, as if the springs had betrayed them by not flowing uphill on command. The construction gangs followed the surveyors, like pilgrims following a sacred path. Where the surveyors had marked the route with stakes and string, the builders raised arches that would carry water across valleys that no natural stream could cross. Each arch was a mathematical poem, curves calculated to distribute weight evenly, stones fitted so precisely that mortar became decoration rather than necessity. I remember the scaffolding forests that grew in the valleys where aqueducts were being built, wooden frameworks, tall as temples, complex as cities, temporary as summer storms. From a distance, they looked like the skeletons of giants, bones of creatures that had died trying to span the impossible distances between hills. Up close, they swarmed with workers who moved like ants along planks and ropes, each man carrying stones that would outlast his great-grandchildren. The workers who built on the scaffolding were acrobats by necessity, dancers partnered with gravity and wind. They learned to read the moods of the wooden platforms that supported them, to feel through their feet when a beam was beginning to weaken, when a joint was working loose, when the entire structure was shifting in ways that could bring death to anyone who trusted it blindly. Many did die not from enemy action or plague, or the dramatic causes that historians record, but from the simple failure of wood and rope to support the weight of ambition. Each stone block that went into an aqueduct arch was shaped by men who understood that their work would be tested, not just by the weight it supported, but by the water it carried. Stone that looked perfect might crumble when subjected to the constant moisture of a water channel. Mortar that seemed solid might dissolve when exposed to the minerals carried by mountain streams. Every material had to be tested not just for strength, but for endurance, not just for today, but for centuries. The arches themselves became cathedrals of engineering, soaring spans that carried not just water, but the hopes of everyone who would depend on that water. From below, they looked impossibly delicate, stone curves hanging in air as if supported by faith rather than physics. From above, on the water channel itself, they were massive constructions that dwarfed the men who walked their maintenance paths, checking for leaks, clearing debris, ensuring that the water continued its ancient dance with gravity. Frontinus walked those maintenance paths regularly, not as an overseer, but as a student, learning from the water how his calculations had succeeded or failed. He would run his fingers along the channel walls, feeling for the telltale roughness that indicated erosion, the slight dampness that warned of leaks, the mineral deposits that showed how the water had interacted with stone over months and years. The gradient was everything. Too steep, and the water would carve its own path, destroying the channel from within. Too shallow, and it would deposit sediment, slowly choking itself on the very materials it was meant to carry away. The perfect slope was a compromise between speed and stability, a mathematical dance between the urgency of flow and the patience of stone. I remember the night Frontinus realized that the Aqua Claudia's gradient was failing. He had been walking the channel by torchlight, checking for winter damage, when he noticed that the water was flowing more slowly than his calculations predicted. The channel was silting up, collecting debris faster than the current could carry it away. Without intervention, the entire aqueduct would become a 40-mile-long pond, breeding mosquitoes instead of delivering clean water. The correction required surgery on a scale that would have terrified lesser engineers. Sections of the channel had to be deepened, their gradients adjusted by fractions of degrees that were barely perceptible to the eye, but crucial to the mathematics of flow. Workers suspended on ropes chiseled away stone dust measured in handfuls, changing slopes by amounts that could be detected only by watching how quickly water moved at precisely measured distances. But water was patient with those who understood it, forgiving to those who learned its lessons. When the corrections were complete, when the gradient had been restored to its proper steepness, the Aqua Claudia flowed again with the strength and consistency that Frontinus had originally calculated. The aqueduct danced with gravity once more, carrying mountain water to city fountains in an endless, invisible ballet of engineering and mathematics. The surveyors who learned from Frontinus carried his knowledge to the far corners of the empire, building aqueducts in Gaul and Spain, in Africa and Asia, wherever Roman citizens needed clean water delivered across impossible distances. Each new aqueduct was a variation on the same theme: water, convinced to flow uphill through the magic of precisely calculated slopes, stone arches that turned valleys into bridges, engineering that made the impossible seem inevitable. But even Frontinus, master of gradients and dancer with gravity, could not calculate for everything. He could predict how water would behave in channels he had designed, but he could not predict how time would change those channels, how earthquakes would shift the foundations, how wars would interrupt the maintenance that kept the water flowing. The aqueducts he built would outlast the empire that commissioned them, carrying water long after the last Roman engineer had forgotten the formulas that made them possible. They were monuments to the marriage of mathematics and stone, testaments to the power of men who learned to whisper to rivers and convince them to flow where rivers had never flowed before. In the end, gravity always leads the dance. But for a few centuries, Roman engineers like Frontinus proved that mortal men could be worthy partners. Gods of the drip, we left rusted nails at sewer grates offerings to Cloaca. Her priests washed their hands in rosewater. I remember when the Temple of Cloaca was the most beautiful building in Rome, its marble columns gleaming white above the very sewers that made its existence necessary. The goddess stood in carved perfection. Venus transformed into something more essential than love, the deity of purification, the sacred guardian of what flows away and what remains behind. Why did rats flee her shrines? The question haunted the priests who served in her temple, who noticed that the rodents that thrived everywhere else in Rome avoided the sacred spaces dedicated to the goddess of sewers. Some whispered that she was too pure for creatures that fed on filth. Others believed the rats understood something that humans had forgotten, that the goddess who ruled over waste was not to be approached lightly, even by scavengers. The paradox of Cloaca lay at the heart of Roman civilization. She was Venus, Cloaca love, and sewerage, united in a single divine being, beauty and filth reconciled through the alchemy of worship. Her temple smelled of roses and frankincense, while her domain reeked of human waste and decay. Her priests wore spotless white robes while tending to the spiritual needs of men whose bodies were permanently stained with the substances they handled daily. I remember the morning rituals, the prayers that began each day's work in the tunnels beneath Rome. The sewer gangs would gather at the temple steps before dawn, their oil lamps flickering like votive candles, their tools blessed by priests who had never descended into the tunnels themselves. The ceremony was brief: a libation of wine poured onto the stones, a handful of grain scattered for the goddess. Words in archaic Latin that even the priests recited more from memory than understanding. But the real worship happened below ground, in the darkness where men worked ankle-deep in the city's waste, where prayers were whispered between labored breaths and offerings were made with calloused hands. They would leave rusted nails at the junction points, where smaller sewers fed into larger ones, iron gifts for the goddess who transformed corruption into cleanliness. They would scratch protective symbols into the tunnel walls' crude renderings of Cloaca's face, geometric patterns that were supposed to ward off cave-ins and gas poisoning. The theology of filth was more complex than the clean-handed priests admitted. Cloaca was not just the goddess who made waste disappear. She was the deity who revealed the truth that waste could never truly disappear, only be transformed, moved, hidden from sight, but never eliminated. Every citizen who used a latrine was participating in a religious act, acknowledging their dependence on the goddess who handled what they could not bear to handle themselves. The priests in the temple above spoke of purification as a spiritual process, a cleansing of the soul that paralleled the cleansing of the body. But the workers in the tunnels knew a different truth, that purification was a physical process, a daily struggle against the accumulation of waste that threatened to drown the city in its own excess. Their hands were never clean, their clothes never free of stains, their bodies never purged of the smells that marked them as servants of the goddess of necessary filth. I remember Gaius Cloacianus, the priest who tried to bridge the gap between temple theology and tunnel reality. He was young when he was assigned to minister to the sewer workers, fresh from training in the clean mysteries of Venus, unprepared for the harsh realities of Venus transformed. He would descend into the tunnels monthly, carrying blessed oil and sacred bread, attempting to bring the comfort of proper worship to men who worked in conditions that defied comfort. The workers tolerated his visits with the patience of men who had seen many priests come and go. They appreciated the blessed oil, not because they believed in its spiritual properties, but because oil was oil, and oil burned in lamps, and lamps kept the darkness at bay. They accepted the sacred bread, not because they felt it brought them closer to the goddess, but because bread was bread, and hungry men were grateful for food that had not been contaminated by sewer water. But gradually, something changed in the young priest. The monthly visits became weekly. The formal rituals became conversations. The clean robes were replaced by practical tunics that could be washed when they became soiled. Gaius Cloacianus began to understand that the true worship of Cloacina happened not in marble temples, but in brick tunnels, not through incense and song, but through the quiet dedication of men who handled the unhandleable so that others might live in cleanliness. The corruption came slowly, as corruption always does. Cloacianus began to accept gifts from the sewer workers, small coins pressed into his palm in gratitude for his visits, trinkets found in the tunnels and cleaned for presentation to someone who had treated them with dignity. He told himself these were offerings to the goddess, donations to the temple that supported his ministry. But the other priests saw them differently, as evidence that their colleague had been contaminated by the very filth he was supposed to spiritually cleanse. The temple hierarchy was not subtle in its disapproval. Successive priests were assigned to assist Cloacianus in his work, supervisors disguised as helpers, watchful eyes that reported back on his growing intimacy with the tunnel workers. The monthly stipend for sewer ministry was reduced, then eliminated entirely. The blessed oil and sacred bread became scarce, then disappeared altogether. I remember the night Cloacianus came to the tunnels for the last time. He carried no sacred implements, wore no priestly robes, brought no blessed offerings. He came as a man speaking to other men, acknowledging what they all knew, that the goddess of sewers was served better by dirty hands than by clean consciences, that the sacred work of purification was accomplished by those who were willing to be defiled for the sake of others. The workers gave him a gift that night, a small statue carved from a piece of marble that had fallen from the temple above, worked smooth by months of handling, shaped into a crude but recognizable figure of Cloacina. It was not beautiful like the temple statue, not perfect in its proportions or refined in its details, but it was honest a goddess who looked like she belonged in the tunnels, who understood the men who served her, who knew that divinity could be found in the darkest places. When Cloacianus was finally dismissed from the temple officially, for irregularities in temple finances, but really for having become too close to the reality of his goddess, he took the statue with him. He found work as a scribe in the city archives, copying out the maintenance records for the aqueducts and sewers, translating the daily reports of the tunnel workers into the clean language that officials preferred to read. But every evening, in the small room where he lived near the Subura, he would light a lamp before the crude statue and offer his own prayers to Cloacina, not the formal supplications he had learned in the temple, but the honest words of a man who had seen the goddess's real work, who understood that her domain was not separate from the world of waste and struggle, but intimately connected to it. The temple continued its rituals, of course. New priests were appointed to minister to the sewer workers, young men who kept their robes clean and their visits brief, who dispensed blessings like medicine and departed quickly to avoid contamination. The morning ceremonies continued, The offerings were made, the prayers were recited, but something had changed in the relationship between the goddess and her servants. The rats, meanwhile, continued to avoid the temple. Whether from divine influence or simple instinct, they seemed to understand what the priests had forgotten, that the sacred and the profane were not opposites, but partners, that the goddess who ruled over waste was too powerful to be approached casually, too important to be served by those who insisted on keeping their hands clean. The workers in the tunnels developed their own rituals, their own offerings, their own ways of acknowledging the divine presence that moved through the sewers like water through stone. They would pause in their work when a tunnel was completed, sharing wine and bread in celebration of another section of the goddess's domain brought into service. They would gather at cave-in sites to honor the men who had died in Cloacina's service, leaving flowers and small coins as offerings to ease the passage of souls who had given their lives to keep the city clean. And in the darkness of the tunnels, where no marble gleamed and no incense burned, the goddess of sewers accepted these offerings with the patience of one who understood that true worship was not about beauty or purity, but about the willingness to serve, to sacrifice, to handle what others could not bear to touch, so that civilization might continue its precarious dance above the flowing waters of necessity. The temple remained beautiful. The priests remained clean. The rituals remained formal and proper. But the real work of the goddess happened in the darkness, among men whose faith was proved not by the words they spoke, but by the depths they were willing to descend. Life of the tunnel walkers. Men emerged squinting, lungs rattling like dry seeds in a gourd. Sunlight felt like betrayal. I remember Marcus Silicius, though. That was not his birth name, merely the name the surface dwellers gave him after 30 years in the tunnels had turned his lungs to stone. He had descended into the Cloaca Maxima as a young slave, barely 16, his body strong and his eyes bright with the kind of hope that only the very young can maintain in the face of impossible circumstances. When I last saw him, 40 years later, he was bent like a question mark, his skin the color of cave fish, his breath a constant wheeze that marked time like a broken clock. What songs did they hum in the blackness? This question haunted me as I watched the cunicularii, the tunnel walkers, emerge from their shifts in the depths beneath Rome. They moved like men surfacing from deep water, blinking rapidly, covering their eyes with hands that had forgotten what sunlight looked like. And sometimes, if you listened carefully, you could catch fragments of melodies that existed nowhere else in the Roman world, songs born in darkness, nursed on echoes, shaped by the rhythms of flowing water and the percussion of dripping stone. The cunicularii were Rome's mole people, citizens of an underground kingdom that most Romans preferred to pretend did not exist. They lived in a world of perpetual twilight, where the brightest light came from oil lamps that could be extinguished by a careless splash or a sudden gust of subterranean wind. Time moved differently in the tunnels, not by the passage of sun and moon, but by the cycles of maintenance, the rhythms of water flow, the slow pulse of a city's digestive system processing its daily waste. Their bodies adapted in ways that disturbed surface dwellers. Shoulders permanently bent from decades of stooping in low passages. Fingers elongated and sensitized, able to read the texture of stone like blind men reading scripture. Eyes that had grown large and pale, designed for gathering what little light existed in their domain. Lungs scarred by years of breathing stone dust and sewer gases, developing the persistent cough that would eventually kill most of them, but meanwhile served as a form of underground communication, a language of wheezed warnings and rasped reassurances. I remember the hierarchy that developed among them, based not on birth or wealth, but on years survived in the depths. The newest workers, still pink-skinned and healthy-lunged, carried the lamps and tools, learned to read the moods of flowing water, practiced the delicate art of moving through tunnels where a misplaced foot could mean death by drowning or burial. The veterans, pale and bent as cave fish, could predict weather changes by the behavior of underground streams. could sense structural weaknesses in tunnel walls by the quality of echoes, could navigate the labyrinth of sewers in complete darkness using senses that surface dwellers had never developed. The work was constant, but not hurried. Water flows at its own pace, responds to its own rhythms, requires patience rather than urgency from those who tend it. The cunicularii learned to move like the water they served, steady, persistent, finding the path of least resistance, flowing around obstacles rather than attempting to overcome them through force. Their workday began when they descended and ended when they ascended, marked not by bells or sundials, but by the completion of tasks that water demanded. They developed their own culture in the depths, their own customs and celebrations, their own ways of marking the passage of time in a world where seasons existed only as variations in the temperature of tunnel walls. New arrivals were initiated not through formal ceremonies, but through gradual acceptance, earned by proving they could work without panic in spaces barely wider than their bodies, that they could breathe calmly when lamp flames flickered low, that they could trust their lives to rope and stone and the competence of men they could barely see. The songs they hummed were working songs, timing songs, memory songs that helped them coordinate their movements in spaces where verbal communication was often impossible. Simple melodies that could be hummed through pursed lips while concentrating on delicate work. Rhythmic chants that synchronized the movements of teams, lifting heavy stones or hauling debris through narrow passages. Some songs were practical counting songs that helped them keep track of distances in the darkness, warning songs that alerted others to dangers ahead. Others were purely for comfort, melodies that connected them to memories of sunlight and surface life, that reminded them they were still human despite their mole-like existence. Marcus Silicius taught me some of these songs during the brief periods when he would surface for supplies or to report on tunnel conditions. His voice was ruined by decades of stone dust, more wheeze than melody, but the tunes were hauntingly beautiful simple progressions that seemed to echo even when he stopped singing, rhythms that matched the pulse of flowing water, harmonies designed to blend with the natural acoustics of arched stone tunnels. The respiratory diseases that plagued the cunicularii were not traumatic killers like plague or fever, but slow stranglers that took years to complete their work. Silicosis, the stone lung disease, began as a minor cough, barely noticeable among men who worked in dusty conditions. Gradually, the cough deepened, became more persistent, began to produce blood-flecked sputum that stained their tunics and marked them as walking dead among their surface-dwelling fellows. But even dying men could work in the tunnels, perhaps especially dying men who had nothing left to lose and everything to give to the work that had already claimed their lives. Marcus Silicius continued descending into the sewers, even when each breath was a struggle, even when climbing the ladder to the surface left him gasping like a landed fish. The tunnels had become more than his workplace. They were his world, his community, his reason for continuing to draw breath, even when breathing had become agony. Cave-ins were the other constant threat, as unpredictable as they were deadly. The Romans built well, but they built heavy, and the earth beneath Rome was honeycombed with tunnels, cisterns, and chambers that created an unstable foundation for the massive stone infrastructure above. When the ground shifted, when too much weight pressed down on weakened supports, entire sections would collapse with a rumble that surface dwellers mistook for thunder. The cunicularii developed an almost supernatural ability to predict cave-ins, reading signs invisible to surface engineers. The quality of echoes in a tunnel could reveal stress fractures in supporting walls. The behavior of rats and insects could indicate structural instability hours before human senses detected any danger. Changes in air pressure, variations in water flow, tiny shifts in the alignment of stones, all these became part of a complex system of underground meteorology that kept most of the tunnel walkers alive most of the time. When cave-ins did occur, the response was swift and methodical. Work gangs would converge on the collapse site, not with dramatic urgency, but with the calm efficiency of men who had performed this rescue many times before. They dug by hand, passing stones from worker to worker in bucket chains that stretched through the tunnels like nervous systems, calling softly to any survivors who might be trapped in air pockets, listening for responses that might guide their digging. Sometimes they found survivors, men who had been caught in the collapse but protected by the arch of fallen stones, who had breathed stale air and waited in darkness for rescue they were not certain would come. More often they found bodies, crushed by the weight of Rome's ambitions, buried in the foundations of the empire they had helped to build. These they carried to the surface with the same care they had shown in life, wrapping them in whatever clean cloth could be found, ensuring that men who had died in darkness were at least buried in sunlight. The families of Cuniculae lived in a strange twilight between surface and depths. They were supported by the wages their men earned in the tunnels, but they rarely saw those men during daylight hours. Children grew up with fathers who were ghosts, present mainly as weary figures glimpsed in lamplight, as voices calling from tunnel mouths, as providers whose work could not be spoken of in polite company. The wives developed their own sisterhood, bound together by the knowledge that their husband's work was both essential and invisible, both necessary and unmentionable. They could recognize each other by the particular stains on their laundry, by the herbs they burned to mask the smells that clung to their husband's clothing, by the way they listened for the sounds of coughing. That would tell them whether their men were still healthy or beginning the slow slide toward stone lung. I remember the funeral of Marcus Cilicius, when his 40 years in the tunnels finally ended with a coughing fit that brought up more blood than air. The service was held at dawn, not because of religious requirement, but because that was when the tunnel workers could attend after their night shift ended before the day shift began. They stood around his grave like pale flowers, squinting in the morning light, their wheezing breaths creating a chorus that was more moving than any formal dirge. They buried him with his lamp, the bronze oil lamp that had lit his way through 4 decades of underground work, its surfaces worn smooth by his hands, its flame extinguished forever. It was not a rich man's funeral, not marked by marble monuments or elaborate ceremonies, but it was attended by men who understood the value of the work he had done, who knew that every breath of clean air in Rome was purchased with the shortened breaths of men like Marcus Cilicius. The new workers who took his place were younger, stronger, still hopeful that they might somehow avoid the fate that had claimed their predecessor. They learned the songs he had taught, walked the routes he had mapped, maintained the sections of tunnel he had tended like gardens. In the darkness beneath Rome, his knowledge lived on, passed from hand to hand, from voice to voice, from one generation of tunnel walkers to the next. The sunlight continued to feel like betrayal to men who spent their lives in darkness. The songs continued to echo in tunnels that had no memory of silence. And somewhere in the depths, Marcus Cilicius's ghost still walked his rounds, checking for leaks, clearing blockages, ensuring that the waters continued to flow, even after the men who tended them had returned to dust. The Cuniculae aged in dog years, their bodies consuming themselves in service to the city above. But their work was eternal, as necessary as breathing, as constant as the flow of water through stone channels carved by forgotten hands for purposes that transcended individual lives. They were Rome's foundation, its hidden strength, its unsung heroes who worked and died in darkness so that others might live in the light. Blood in the lead pipes patricians sipped sweet poison from silver cups. Their hands shook. They called it the Emperor's Tremor. I remember watching Senator Lucius Crassus raise his cup at a dinner party, his fingers trembling so violently that wine sloshed onto the marble table like drops of blood. He was not yet 40, but his hands moved like those of an ancient man, and his eyes held the distant confusion that had begun to afflict Rome's wealthiest families with increasing frequency. The other guests politely ignored his condition, as they ignored their own similar symptoms. attributing them to the stresses of wealth and power rather than to the very pipes that delivered luxury to their tables. Who first linked madness to the pipes? The question haunted the few physicians who dared to suggest that Rome's greatest engineering achievement might also be its most insidious killer. The lead pipes that brought sweet mountain water directly to the homes of the wealthy were marvels of metallurgy and hydraulics, but they were also slow-acting murderers, leaching their poison into every cup, every bath, every meal prepared with water that had traveled through the soft, malleable metal that Romans called plumbum. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. The poor, who could not afford private water connections, drank from public fountains fed by clay pipes and stone channels. The water tasted the same, came from the same alpine springs, flowed through the same aqueducts, across the same impossible distances. But it reached the poor through materials that did not dissolve into the liquid they carried, while the wealthy received their water through a network of lead pipes that grew more dangerous with each passing year. The symptoms developed so gradually that they seemed like natural consequences of successful living. Joint pain that physicians attributed to rich food and sedentary lifestyles. Memory loss that was explained as the inevitable result of too much wine and too little physical labor. Tremors that were dismissed as nervous conditions brought on by the responsibilities of governing an empire. Fertility problems that were blamed on the moral corruption of the upper classes rather than the metal corruption of their water supply. I remember the bathhouses of the wealthy districts, where steam rose from pools fed directly by lead pipes, where patricians soaked in water that had absorbed metal toxins during its journey from aqueduct to basin. The baths were temples to Roman engineering, heated floors, precisely controlled temperatures, marble surfaces that reflected the bodies of citizens who believed they were purifying themselves, while unknowingly absorbing poisons that would accumulate in their organs for years before manifesting as disease. The lead pipes themselves were works of art, crafted by plumbers who took pride in their ability to shape the soft metal into complex networks that could carry water around corners, up inclines, through walls and under floors. The joints were soldered with care, the connections tested for pressure, the entire system designed to be invisible to the homeowners who depended on it. Water arrived silently, without the dramatic gush of public fountains, creating the illusion that wealth could command the elements without visible effort. But the metal remembered every drop of water that passed through it. Lead is patient, giving up its atoms slowly, steadily, in concentrations too small to taste but large enough to kill. The aristocratic families who prided themselves on their superior access to clean water were poisoning themselves with every meal. Every bath, every cup of wine mixed with water that had spent days or weeks dissolving microscopic quantities of the pipes that delivered it. The children suffered most. Their growing bodies absorbed the lead more readily than adult systems, concentrating the poison in developing brains and bones. The sons and daughters of senators grew up with learning difficulties that their tutors attributed to laziness or moral failings. They developed behavioral problems that were explained as the natural rebelliousness of youth. They suffered from stunted growth that was blamed on their privileged lifestyle rather than on the water. They drank from silver cups filled by lead pipes. Marcus Vitruvius, the great engineer, had warned against lead pipes in his treatises on architecture. He wrote that water workers who smelted lead developed unhealthy complexions, that the metal was associated with illness and death. But his warnings were buried in technical discussions of construction techniques, overlooked by the wealthy Romans who saw lead pipes as symbols of their superior status rather than instruments of their gradual destruction. The contrast was visible in the very architecture of water distribution. Wealthy homes featured elaborate private baths, heated pools, and indoor fountains, all fed by lead pipes that brought death disguised as luxury. The poor gathered at public fountains that announced their presence with dramatic spouts and ornate basins, making a spectacle of what the rich kept hidden behind their walls. But the spectacle was also salvation water that flowed too quickly through stone and clay, channels to absorb dangerous levels of toxic metals. The physicians who served the wealthy families developed their own theories to explain the epidemic of tremors, madness, and early death that plagued their patients. Some blamed the gods, suggesting that the aristocracy had somehow offended the deities who controlled health and longevity. Others pointed to moral corruption, arguing that the symptoms were divine punishment for the excesses of wealth and power. A few suggested dietary causes, recommending changes in eating habits that might alleviate conditions they could observe but not truly understand. But Dr. Caius Asclepiades was different. He was a Greek physician who had studied in Alexandria, where scholars had access to medical texts that explored the relationship between metals and human health. He began to notice patterns among his wealthy patients. Families who lived in homes with the most elaborate plumbing systems showed the highest rates of neurological problems. Neighborhoods with the newest lead pipes reported more cases of mental confusion and physical weakness than areas where water was delivered through older clay systems. His observations were not welcomed by his patients, who preferred explanations that did not implicate their lifestyle choices or engineering achievements. When he suggested that lead pipes might be contributing to their health problems, he was dismissed as a foreign physician who did not understand Roman superiority in hydraulic engineering. When he recommended that wealthy families consider drinking water from public fountains rather than from their private systems, he was accused of trying to humiliate his patients by forcing them to mingle with commoners. The social implications of lead poisoning extended beyond individual health to the structure of Roman society itself. The wealthy families who ruled the empire were slowly poisoning themselves with their own luxury, while the poor masses who they governed remained relatively protected by their inability to afford private plumbing. Power was concentrated in the hands of men whose judgment was being impaired by accumulated metal toxins, whose decision-making abilities were being undermined by the very infrastructure that marked their elevated status. I remember the dinner party where Senator Marcus Antonius announced his solution to the water problem. He had commissioned new pipes made from silver rather than lead, believing that the more expensive metal would deliver purer water to his household. The other guests murmured approval, several of them making mental notes to commission similar upgrades for their own homes. None of them understood that the problem was not the quality of the metal, but the principle of using any metal that could dissolve into drinking water. The lead poisoning of Rome's elite was a slow-motion catastrophe that unfolded over generations rather than years. Families that had ruled for centuries began producing sons who could not manage simple arithmetic, daughters who suffered seizures that had no apparent cause, heirs who died young from mysterious illnesses that physicians could not diagnose or treat. The genetic damage accumulated, passed from parent to child through bloodlines that carried both the wealth to afford lead pipes and the accumulated toxins that wealth delivered. The records kept by household slaves provide glimpses into the daily reality of lead poisoning among the wealthy. Entries describing masters who forgot important meetings, mistresses who could not remember the names of their own children, heirs who suffered from fits of rage, followed by periods of confused lethargy. The symptoms were attributed to everything except the water system that made their lifestyle possible. Meanwhile, in the tenements and workshops where the poor lived, families remained relatively healthy despite their poverty. They lacked the private baths, the heated pools, the indoor fountains that marked aristocratic homes. But they also lacked the lead pipes that delivered slow death along with convenience. Their children learned faster, lived longer, and produced more viable offspring than the children of senators and wealthy merchants who drank from silver cups filled with poisoned water. The great sewers that carried away the waste of both rich and poor received the contaminated excrement of lead poison, aristocrats along with the healthier waste of the masses. In the democratic darkness of the Cloaca Maxima, the poisoned and the pure mixed together, flowing toward the Tiber and eventually to the sea, where the lead would settle into sediments that would preserve the chemical signature of Rome's slow-motion suicide for archaeologists to discover 2,000 years later. The aqueduct system that had been designed to bring life to Rome was gradually bringing death to its ruling class. The engineering that had been celebrated as proof of Roman superiority over nature was actually proof of nature's patient ability to exact revenge on those who thought they could improve on her designs. Water, it seemed, was not meant to flow through soft metal pipes. No matter how skillfully crafted or expensively installed, Dr. Asclepiades eventually left Rome, frustrated by patients who preferred comfortable explanations to uncomfortable truths. He settled in Athens, where he continued his research into the health effects of metals, writing treatises that would not be rediscovered until long after the Roman Empire had fallen. His warnings about lead pipes were preserved in medical libraries that survived the Dark Ages, waiting for future civilizations to rediscover the lessons that Rome had refused to learn. The patricians continued to sip their sweet poison from silver cups, their hands trembling with what they insisted on calling the emperor's tremor. They built more elaborate plumbing systems, commissioned more artistic fountains, invested more wealth in the infrastructure that was slowly killing them. They never understood that their greatest engineering triumph was also their most intimate enemy, that the pipes they were so proud of were writing their death sentences one drop at a time. In the end, lead is patient. It does not hurry. It does not announce its presence. It simply accumulates, slowly and steadily, until the body can no longer process the burden it has been asked to carry. The wealthy Romans who thought they were buying superiority with their lead pipes were actually purchasing inferior health, trading their vitality for the illusion of luxury, dying by degrees in homes that represented the pinnacle of engineering achievement. The water flowed on, indifferent to the social status of those who drank it, carrying its hidden cargo of dissolved metal to rich and poor alike, but concentrating its poison in the homes of those who could afford to bring it closest to their daily lives. Plague's hydraulic whisper fever traveled the aqueducts like gossip. We heard coughing echo through pipes before corpses piled high. I remember the morning when the first reports reached the city prefect's office, not traumatic accounts of sudden death, but whispered observations from the tunnel walkers, who had noticed something wrong with the quality of echoes in the underground channels. The sound was different, they said. Voices from the streets above seemed muffled, distorted, as if the very air in the tunnels had thickened. Only later would we understand that what they were hearing was the beginning of the plague of 65, carried through Rome's own circulatory system, like poison in blood. Did engineers know they carried death? This question haunted me as I watched Sextus Frontinus, nephew of the great water commissioner, trace the path of contamination through aqueduct, maps that suddenly seemed less like engineering diagrams and more like charts of contagion. His finger followed the Aqua Marcia from its source in the Sabine Hills to its terminus at the public fountains, marking each junction where pure mountain water might have encountered the seeds of disease. The plague did not announce itself with dramatic symptoms or sudden collapse. It whispered its arrival through the water system that Romans had built to protect themselves from exactly this kind of catastrophe. The engineering that was supposed to carry away disease instead became its highway, spreading infection from district to district with the same efficiency that it delivered fresh water to public fountains. The first cases appeared in the neighborhoods served by the newest aqueduct extensions, areas where recent construction had disturbed underground water sources, where fresh channels cut through soil that had been undisturbed for centuries. Workers who had broken through into ancient Etruscan burial chambers reported finding stagnant pools that smelled of corruption and death. Those pools, they now realized, had been connected to the water system through hairline cracks in tunnel walls, through seepage that no engineer had anticipated. Marcus Junius, the tunnel supervisor for the Aqua Claudia, was among the first to recognize the pattern. He had spent 30 years maintaining the underground channels. learning to read the moods of flowing water like a priest reading auguries. When the water began to taste different, not obviously contaminated, but somehow wrong, somehow heavy with invisible corruption, he knew that something had changed in the source. But knowing and being believed were different things. When Junius reported his concerns to the aqueduct commissioners, they dismissed his observations as the paranoid fantasies of a man who had spent too many years underground. Water was water, they insisted. If it flowed clear and cold from the mountain springs, if it passed through properly constructed channels, if it emerged from fountain spouts without visible contamination, then it was safe for public consumption. The commissioners had their own concerns, political pressures from citizens who had been promised reliable water supplies, financial pressures from contractors who had invested heavily in aqueduct construction, social pressures from wealthy families whose private bath systems depended on consistent flow from the public system. The last thing they wanted to hear was that their greatest achievement might be spreading death through the very infrastructure they had built to preserve life. I remember the night meetings that began to occur in the tunnel systems themselves, gatherings of maintenance workers who shared information that their supervisors refused to hear. They spoke in whispers, their voices barely audible above the sound of flowing water, comparing observations from different sections of the network. The Aqua Virgo was carrying more debris than usual. The Aqua Tepula showed signs of contamination from surface runoff. The Aqua Julia's flow rate had changed, suggesting blockages that might be trapping organic matter in places where it could decompose and breed disease. The workers developed their own early warning system, independent of official channels, that seemed determined to ignore evidence of contamination. Messages passed from tunnel to tunnel through the network of maintenance shafts and service passages that connected different aqueducts. When one crew discovered dead fish in a distribution chamber, word spread through the underground community within hours. When another crew found rat carcasses floating in a settling tank, the information was shared immediately with workers throughout the system. But the plague moved faster than their warnings. It flowed with the water itself, invisible and patient, carried to every fountain, every bath, every cup that was filled from the aqueduct system. The incubation period meant that people could be infected for days before showing symptoms, spreading the disease through normal social contact while believing themselves to be perfectly healthy. The symptoms, when they finally appeared, seemed unrelated to water at first. A persistent cough that physicians attributed to seasonal changes in the air. A fever that came and went like the tides. A weakness that patients blamed on overwork or worry. Only when the cases began to cluster around specific fountains, specific bathhouses, specific neighborhoods, served by particular aqueduct branches, did the pattern become undeniable. Dr. Galen, the Greek physician who served Marcus Aurelius, was among the first to propose that the plague was being spread through the water system rather than through the air or through direct contact between infected individuals. His observations were methodical, scientific, based on careful mapping of cases and rigorous analysis of symptoms. But his conclusions were so disturbing that even he hesitated to publish them. If the aqueducts were spreading plague, then the entire foundation of Roman urban life was compromised. The engineering achievement that had made possible the growth of Rome into a city of over 1 million inhabitants was simultaneously making possible the rapid spread of disease through that same population. The solution to urban crowding had become the mechanism for urban catastrophe. The tunnel walkers, meanwhile, were dying at rates that could no longer be ignored or explained away. These were men who spent their working lives in direct contact with the water system, who drank from underground streams, who breathed the humid air of tunnel spaces where water mist carried whatever contamination the liquid contained. Their death rate was 10 times higher than the general population's, a fact that officials tried to attribute to the naturally dangerous conditions of tunnel work rather than to plague transmission. Gaius Silanus, one of the few tunnel supervisors who survived the plague, kept detailed records of his workers' symptoms and death rates. His journal, discovered centuries later during medieval excavations, provides a clinical account of how disease moved through the underground community. The first symptoms were always respiratory, the persistent cough that tunnel workers called stone lung, but which, during the plague, progressed much more rapidly than usual to bloody sputum and difficulty breathing. The fever came next, accompanied by the characteristic weakness that made it difficult for workers to climb the ladders that connected tunnel systems to surface access points. Men who had spent decades moving easily through confined spaces began to struggle with tasks that had once been routine. The lucky ones collapsed underground, where their bodies were quickly discovered by fellow workers. The unlucky ones made it to the surface before succumbing, potentially spreading infection to family members and neighbors who had no connection to the water system. The official response was to increase the frequency of tunnel inspections, as if the plague could be stopped by more careful maintenance of infrastructure that was actually spreading the disease. Work crews were ordered to flush the channels more regularly, to clear debris more thoroughly, to check for leaks and blockages that might be contributing to contamination. But these measures only increased workers' exposure to infected water, accelerating the spread of plague through the underground community. I remember the morning when the Cloaca Maxima was found completely blocked by human bodies, not victims of cave-ins or accidents, but plague corpses that had been dumped into the sewer system by families who had no other way to dispose of their dead. The tunnel that had been built to carry away the waste of empire was now carrying away the empire's victims, processing death along with sewage and channels that had not been designed for such grim cargo. The blockage created a backup that flooded entire neighborhoods with contaminated water that carried not just the usual urban waste, but the decomposing remains of plague victims. Streets that had been protected from flooding for decades were suddenly underwater, and the water carried disease directly into homes that had previously been safe from contamination. The cleanup required volunteers willing to descend into the flooded tunnels and manually remove the bodies that were blocking the flow. Most of these volunteers were slaves who had no choice in the matter, men who understood that they were being sent to die, but who lacked the social position to refuse orders from their masters. They worked in teams, passing corpses from hand to hand through tunnel systems that had become underwater morgues. The irony was not lost on the few observers who understood what was happening. The engineering system that had been built to protect Rome from disease was now spreading that disease more efficiently than any natural mechanism could have achieved. The aqueducts that brought clean water from mountain sources were carrying contamination directly to public fountains. The sewers that were supposed to remove waste were backing up and flooding neighborhoods with water that contained the decomposing remains of plague victims. Yet even as the plague spread through Rome's hydraulic circulatory system, even as the evidence mounted that the water infrastructure was functioning as a disease transmission network, the official response remained focused on engineering solutions rather than engineering problems. More tunnels were dug to relieve pressure on existing systems. More settling tanks were built to filter water that was being contaminated at its source. More distribution chambers were constructed to redirect flow from channels that had been compromised by disease. The plague eventually burned itself out, as plagues do, leaving behind a transformed city and a water system that had been permanently changed by its experience as a transmission mechanism for death. The survivors included those who had been lucky enough to avoid infection, those whose immune systems had been strong enough to overcome the disease, and those who had been wise enough to stop drinking from public fountains and bathing in public baths when the outbreak was at its worst. The tunnel walkers who survived carried with them knowledge that would be passed down through generations of underground. Workers an understanding that the water system they maintained was capable of carrying more than water, that the infrastructure they served could become their enemy, that the engineering marvel that defined Roman civilization was also capable of destroying it. Memory and mortar old maps rotted. New diggers got lost. That crack? A foreman pointed. That's where Marcus drowned. I remember when the Imperial Archives still held the original plans for the Cloaca Maxima, drawn on parchment that had already been ancient when Frontinus consulted it for his water treatises. The diagrams were precise but cryptic, showing tunnel routes and junction points without indicating the human stories that had shaped their construction. Each line on the map represented months of digging, years of planning, lifetimes of experience that could not be captured in geometric precision. Whose names are written in the brick dust? This question haunted the new generation of engineers who inherited Rome's water system without inheriting the knowledge of how it had been built. The official records spoke of cubic measurements in flow rates, construction costs, and completion dates. But they said nothing about the techniques that had been used to cut through bedrock, the solutions that had been developed for problems that occurred only once in a generation, the hard-won wisdom that lived in the hands and memories of men who had worked underground for decades. By the time of Marcus Aurelius, the great builders were dying faster than they could train replacements. The cuniculari, who had learned their craft from Etruscan slaves, were themselves becoming elderly, their bodies worn out by decades of tunnel work, their specialized knowledge at risk of disappearing with them. The younger workers who took their places had been trained in surface construction, in the building of temples and basilicas and monuments that reached toward the sky rather than burrowing into the earth. Lucius Nerva, appointed as tunnel supervisor in the year of the 4 emperors, discovered this knowledge gap when he attempted to expand the sewer network beneath the Aventine Hill. The official plans showed where new tunnels should be dug, but they did not show the underground springs that old workers knew to avoid, the unstable soil conditions that veterans could recognize by texture and smell, the seasonal variations in water table levels that could turn a routine excavation into a death trap. The first cave-in occurred 3 weeks into the project. 5 workers were buried when a section of tunnel wall collapsed during what should have been routine maintenance. The official investigation blamed faulty construction techniques, but the surviving tunnel walkers whispered different explanations. The new supervisors did not know how to read the signs that warned of structural instability. They had not learned the old methods for testing soil composition before digging. They were working from maps without understanding the landscape those maps tried to describe. I remember the morning when Gaius Fabricius, the last of the Etruscan-trained tunnel masters, agreed to share his knowledge with the younger engineers. He was nearly 70, bent and wheezing from 50 years of underground work, but his memory held details that existed nowhere else. He could describe the precise mixture of lime and volcanic ash that had been used to waterproof tunnel joints in different soil conditions. He knew which sections of the sewer system required seasonal adjustments to maintain proper flow. He understood the complex relationship between tunnel depth, water pressure, and structural stability that kept the entire system functioning. But knowledge that lives in memory dies with memory. Fabricius could demonstrate techniques that could not be adequately described in words, could teach skills that required years of practice to master, could pass on insights that made sense only to men who had experienced the specific conditions where that knowledge applied. The younger engineers took careful notes, made detailed drawings, tried to capture in writing what Fabricius offered through direct instruction. But they were translating between different languages, the language of experience and the language of documentation, and something was always lost in the translation. The imperial bureaucracy, meanwhile, was more interested in expansion than preservation. New emperors wanted new construction projects that would bear their names and demonstrate their achievements. Maintaining existing infrastructure was less glamorous than building new monuments, less politically valuable than creating visible symbols of imperial power. The budget allocations reflected these priorities: generous funding for new aqueducts and bath complexes, minimal resources for the maintenance work that kept existing systems operational. The record-keeping system that developed during this period reflected the gap between official knowledge and practical knowledge. The written reports filed by tunnel supervisors described routine maintenance activities in standardized language. That could be understood by bureaucrats who had never descended into a sewer. Cleared blockage in Section 7 might mean anything from removing accumulated debris to recovering human bodies that had been dumped into the system. Repaired structural damage could refer to patching minor cracks or rebuilding entire tunnel sections after major collapses. The tunnel workers developed their own informal record-keeping system, based on oral tradition and physical landmarks that would be meaningful to their successors. They named tunnel sections after memorable events: Marcus Pool for the place where a worker had drowned during a flash flood, the Crying Wall for a stretch where groundwater seeped through cracks and created a constant dripping sound, Dead Man's Turn for a junction where cave-ins had claimed multiple victims over the years. These names carried more practical information than the official designations could convey. Marcus's Pool warned future workers that this section was prone to sudden flooding during heavy rains. The Crying Wall indicated structural problems that required careful monitoring. Dead Man's Turn marked a location where extra safety precautions were essential, but this knowledge was fragile, dependent on continuity of personnel and stability of working conditions that the imperial system could not guarantee. I remember the day when a new work crew, unfamiliar with local conditions, entered the tunnel section that veterans called the Throat, a narrow passage, where workers had learned to move quickly because of unstable overhead conditions. The newcomers did not know the history of the name, did not understand the urgency that experienced workers felt when passing through this area. They stopped to rest in what seemed like a convenient widening of the tunnel, not realizing that the space had been created by previous collapses and was likely to collapse again. The cave-in that killed 3 of them could have been prevented by knowledge that lived only in the memories of workers who were not present that day. The official investigation concluded that the deaths were due to inadequate safety procedures, but the surviving tunnel walkers knew better. The deaths were due to the loss of institutional memory, the failure to pass on knowledge that could save lives, but that did not fit into the standardized reporting formats preferred by bureaucratic oversight. The problem was not limited to safety issues. The efficiency of the entire water system depended on maintenance techniques that had been developed through generations of trial and error, refined through experience that could not be replicated in training programs or captured in instruction manuals. The seasonal adjustments that kept aqueduct flow rates optimal, the cleaning procedures that prevented dangerous blockages in sewer channels, the repair methods that could extend the life of aging infrastructure. All of this knowledge was at risk as the workers who possessed it aged out of the system. Frontinus had recognized this problem and attempted to address it through his written treatises on water management. But his writings, comprehensive as they were, focused on the theoretical principles of hydraulic engineering rather than the practical details of day-to-day maintenance. He could explain how water pressure varied with elevation and how flow rates were affected by channel gradients, but he could not adequately describe the subtle signs that warned experienced workers of impending system failures. The solution that eventually emerged was a hybrid system that combined official documentation with unofficial knowledge preservation. Senior tunnel walkers were assigned to work alongside newer employees, not in formal training relationships, but in practical partnerships that allowed knowledge transfer through direct collaboration. The experienced workers continued to use their traditional naming systems and storytelling methods, while also contributing to more systematic documentation efforts that attempted to capture their insights in formats that could be preserved and transmitted. But even this compromise approach could not fully solve the fundamental problem. Knowledge that had been developed through decades of underground work could not be quickly transferred to surface-trained engineers who lacked the experiential foundation to understand what they were being taught. The sensory skills that allowed veteran tunnel walkers to detect structural problems by sound and smell. The intuitive understanding of water behavior that came from years of working in flooded tunnels. The physical conditioning that allowed men to work safely in confined spaces. None of this could be acquired through classroom instruction or even through supervised apprenticeships that lasted only months rather than years. The Imperial Archives continued to accumulate reports and documentation, creating an impressive collection of paperwork that gave the illusion of comprehensive knowledge management. But the real knowledge, the knowledge that kept the water flowing and the tunnels stable, remained locked in the minds and bodies of a shrinking population of aging workers who had learned their craft in an earlier era, when time and necessity had allowed for the kind of thorough, experiential training that the modern system could no longer support. I remember visiting those archives years later, when the parchment had begun to crumble and the ink had faded to illegibility. The maps that had once seemed so precise and authoritative were revealing themselves to be incomplete sketches of a system too complex to be fully documented. The reports that had been filed with such bureaucratic confidence were proving inadequate guides for workers who needed to understand not just what to do, but how to do it, when to do it, and why it mattered. The brick dust held more reliable records than the official documentation. Each stain on a tunnel wall told a story of water flow and structural stress. Each crack in the mortar revealed information about settlement patterns and material failures. Each worn spot on a stone step recorded the passage of thousands of workers over decades of maintenance activities. But reading these records required the kind of intimate familiarity with the system that took years to develop, and that was becoming increasingly rare as the knowledge gap widened between official oversight and practical expertise. The names written in the brick dust were not the names of emperors or engineers who had designed the system, but the names of workers who had lived and died in its tunnels, who had learned its secrets through direct experience, who had passed on their knowledge through stories and demonstrations that could not be preserved in any archive. Their legacy lived on in the continuing function of infrastructure they had maintained, but their wisdom was disappearing with them, leaving behind systems that still worked, but that were increasingly managed by people who did not fully understand how or why they worked. The old maps rotted, as maps do when they are made of organic materials and stored in humid conditions. The new maps were more durable, but less complete, drawn by surveyors who could measure distances accurately, but who could not capture the subtle complexities that made the difference between functional and dysfunctional infrastructure. And in the tunnels themselves, the ghosts of dead workers continued to point out the cracks where Marcus had drowned, where Gaius had been crushed, where centuries of accumulated experience had been buried along with the men who had possessed it. Silence after the fall, when barbarians camped above, the tunnels wept louder. Moss softened the screams. I remember the last morning when the lamps were lit in the Cloaca Maxima, according to the old schedule, when the tunnel walkers descended for their shifts as they had for centuries, unaware that the empire whose waste they processed was already dissolving above their heads. The water continued to flow, as water always does, indifferent to the political catastrophes that transform the surface world. But the men who tended that flow were beginning to understand that their work had become an elegy for a civilization that no longer had the strength to maintain what it had built. Who was the last to extinguish his lamp? This question haunted me as I watched Rome's population dwindle from over 1 million inhabitants to perhaps 50,000, as the great public works that had defined imperial life fell into disrepair and abandonment. The aqueducts still carried water from the mountain springs, but with fewer people to serve and fewer resources for maintenance, the flow gradually diminished. The sewers still drained the 7 hills, but what they drained now was the runoff from a ghost city, the waste of a population that had shrunk to a shadow of its former size. The barbarian invasions were not traumatic events in the tunnels beneath Rome. No armies marched through sewer channels. No battles were fought in the arched chambers, where tunnel walkers had labored for generations. But the effects were felt in subtler ways, in the gradual reduction of maintenance crews, in the elimination of the specialized positions that had required years of training to fill, in the slow transformation of a sophisticated hydraulic system into a collection of abandoned channels where water found its own path through increasingly unreliable infrastructure. Alaric's Goths camped in the Forum, but they showed no interest in the tunnels that lay beneath their feet. The Vandals who sacked the city in 455 stripped valuables from temples and palaces, but left the sewer system untouched, not from respect for Roman engineering, but from simple indifference to infrastructure they did not understand and could not use. To barbarian chieftains who measured wealth in gold and slaves, the greatest hydraulic achievement in human history was simply invisible, irrelevant to their immediate needs and long-term plans. But the tunnels felt the weight of the camps above. I remember walking through the Cloaca Maxima during the Gothic occupation, hearing sounds that had never echoed through those chambers before, the neighing of horses stabled in the Forum, the clash of weapons being sharpened on marble steps, the guttural conversations of men who spoke languages that had no words for aqueducts or drainage, or the careful engineering that had made their temporary city possible. The weeping of the tunnels was literal as well as metaphorical. Without proper maintenance, the waterproof seals that had kept groundwater out of the system began to fail. Springs that had been carefully channeled into the aqueduct network found new paths through tunnel walls, creating leaks that gradually widened into streams, then torrents that carved new channels through structures that had been built to last for eternity. The sound of dripping water, always present in the tunnels, became a constant cascade that made conversation difficult and navigation treacherous. The moss came slowly, as decay always does. First, just a green fuzz in the joints between stones where moisture had collected for years. Then thicker patches that cushioned the footsteps of the few remaining workers who still descended into the depths to check on conditions and report back to supervisors who had less and less authority to act on what they learned. Eventually, carpets of moss that softened the harsh geometry of Roman engineering, transforming precisely fitted stonework into organic curves that belonged more to natural caves than to human construction. The abandonment was not sudden or complete. For decades after the fall of the Western Empire, skeleton crews continued to maintain critical sections of the water system. Byzantine administrators who governed Rome in the name of distant emperors recognized that the city could not survive without some form of water supply and waste disposal. But their resources were limited, their priorities divided between many competing demands, and their understanding of hydraulic engineering was superficial, compared to the deep knowledge that had been lost with the craftsmen who had built and maintained the original systems. I remember Cassiodorus, a Gothic minister who tried to preserve Roman administrative practices under barbarian rule, standing at the mouth of the Cloaca Maxima and dictating a letter to Constantinople requesting funds for sewer maintenance. His words were eloquent, his arguments logical, his understanding of the system's importance clear and accurate. But his letter was one of thousands competing for attention from an imperial treasury that was already overstretched, and his request was denied, along with most others that dealt with infrastructure rather than immediate military needs. The workers who remained were mostly locals Romans who had learned tunnel work from their fathers and grandfathers, who continued their labor not because they were paid adequately for it, but because they understood that their city would become uninhabitable if the water system failed completely. They worked with salvaged materials, improvised solutions, and a gradually diminishing supply of the specialized tools that proper sewer maintenance required. Their repairs were temporary patches rather than permanent solutions, stopgap measures that delayed catastrophic failure without preventing gradual deterioration. The population that these workers served was also changing. The wealthy patricians who had lived in palaces with private plumbing systems had mostly fled to Constantinople or to safer cities in the eastern provinces. Merchants and craftsmen, who had formed the backbone of Rome's middle class, had either died in the various sieges and plagues, or had emigrated to places where commerce could still flourish. What remained was a population of subsistence farmers, minor clerics, and urban poor who used the public fountains and latrines, but who lacked the resources to maintain the complex infrastructure that served them. The medieval Romans, who inherited the ruins of the imperial city, developed their own relationship with the tunnel systems. They knew the sewers existed, the entrances were too large to hide, the sound of flowing water too obvious to ignore. But they had lost the technical knowledge needed to maintain the system properly, and they had developed a superstitious fear of the underground spaces that their ancestors had built with such confidence and skill. Stories began to circulate about the creatures that lived in the abandoned tunnels, not the ordinary rats and insects that had always inhabited the sewers, but monsters born from the corruption that accumulated in neglected chambers, demons that fed on the waste of a dying civilization. These stories served a practical purpose, discouraging curious exploration of tunnel systems that had become genuinely dangerous due to structural collapse and toxic gas accumulation. But they also reflected a psychological transformation in the way Romans understood their relationship to the infrastructure that surrounded them. The aqueducts suffered even more dramatic decline than the sewers. The mountain sources continued to produce clean water, but the channels that carried that water to the city required constant maintenance to remain functional. Without regular cleaning, the gradual accumulation of mineral deposits and organic debris gradually reduced flow rates. Without proper repair of weather damage, winter freezes and summer floods created breaks in the channels that diverted water away from its intended destinations. One by one, the great aqueducts ceased to function. The Aqua Claudia, which had carried 47 million gallons per day to Rome at the height of the empire, was reduced to a trickle by the 6th century. The Aqua Marcia, celebrated by poets for the purity of its mountain water, became clogged with sediment and debris. The Aqua Virgo, which had supplied the Campus Martis and the public baths, survived longer than the others, but was eventually reduced to supplying only a few fountains in the most populated areas of the city. The silence that descended on the tunnel systems was not the silence of death, but the silence of abandonment. Water continued to flow through the channels, but at reduced volume and with irregular patterns that reflected the breakdown of the control systems that had once regulated distribution throughout the city. The sound of human activity, the voices of workers, the splash of maintenance crews, the echo of footsteps on stone walkways faded away, leaving only the natural sounds of water finding its own path through increasingly uncontrolled channels. But even in abandonment, the Roman engineering proved its quality. Sections of the Cloaca Maxima continued to function throughout the medieval period, carrying rainwater and waste from the contracted city to the Tiber River. The stone arches that had been built to last for millennia did indeed last, supporting their own weight and the weight of the medieval city that grew up around and above them. The gradients that had been calculated to move water efficiently continued to work, even when the channels they served were partially blocked or diverted from their original purposes. I remember visiting Rome during the Renaissance, when interest in classical antiquity was beginning to revive, when scholars and artists were rediscovering the achievements of their imperial predecessors. The sewer system that I found was a hybrid of Roman engineering and medieval adaptation. Ancient stone channels lined with medieval brick repairs, classical architecture integrated with improvised solutions that had been developed over centuries of making do with declining resources. The tunnel workers of that era were still using some of the techniques that had been developed during the imperial period, knowledge that had been passed down through generations of craftsmen who had never stopped working in the underground spaces that tourists and scholars were just beginning to explore. But they had also developed new methods adapted to changed conditions, ways of working with partially collapsed structures, techniques for maintaining systems that could no longer be fully repaired or replaced. The moss had indeed softened the screams, not just metaphorically, but literally. The organic growth that covered much of the tunnel system absorbed sound, creating an acoustic environment that was quieter and more muffled than the sharp echoes that had characterized the imperial sewers. The screams were still there, encoded in the stones that remembered the workers who had died in cave-ins and gas explosions, the citizens who had perished in plagues that spread through contaminated water, the entire civilization that had trusted its survival to infrastructure that outlasted the knowledge needed to maintain it properly. But the moss also softened the harsh edges of imperial ambition, transforming the aggressive geometry of Roman engineering into something more organic, more integrated with the natural processes that had always shaped the landscape beneath the Seven Hills. In abandonment, the sewer system was returning to something closer to its original state as natural drainage channels, modified by human intervention, but no longer dominated by human purposes. The last lamp to be extinguished in the tunnels beneath Rome was probably not extinguished by human hands at all, but simply ran out of oil when there was no one left to refill it. No one remaining who remembered that the light was supposed to be maintained. No one who understood that the darkness which followed would mark the end of one of humanity's greatest experiments in urban infrastructure management. Yet even in that darkness, water continued to flow, as it had before Rome existed, and as it would long after Rome was forgotten. The tunnels wept, but their tears carried away the waste of whatever population remained above, continuing the ancient work of purification and disposal that had made civilization possible in the first place. The empire fell, but the sewers endured not in their original glory, but in their essential function, serving a smaller city with reduced efficiency but unbroken continuity, connecting the Rome that was to the Rome that would be through the patient underground rivers that had always been the city's most reliable foundation. Echoes in modern stone, the tunnels never truly died. When Alaric's Visigoths picked through Rome's corpse in 410 CE, when Genseric's Vandals stripped her altars in 455, when Odoacer finally snuffed the last imperial candle in 476, the sewers kept flowing. Empires collapse from the top down, but infrastructure ... Infrastructure rots from the bottom up. And sometimes, if you build it deep enough, strong enough, with enough reverence for the weight of stone, it simply refuses to die. Walk through London's Victorian sewers today, and you'll find Roman foundations. Paris built her grand egouts over Letitia's ancient channels. Even in distant Cologne, German engineers still follow, gradients laid down when Caesar's legions first crossed the Rhine. The mathematics of flowing water doesn't change with dynasties. Gravity serves no emperor, but it's more than just the stone that survived. Medieval chroniclers, writing by candlelight in monastery scriptoriums, copied Frontinus's De Aqueductu with trembling hands. They didn't understand half the Latin technical terms spicus, castellum, quinaria, but they sensed the sacred geometry hidden in those measurements. Monks who'd never seen an aqueduct drew careful diagrams of settling tanks and distribution chambers, preserving knowledge they couldn't use, for civilizations they couldn't imagine. The Renaissance brought hungry scholars. They descended into flooded Roman tunnels with lanterns and measuring ropes, translating Vitruvius while standing knee-deep in medieval muck. Palladio sketched cross-sections of the Cloaca Maxima. Brunelleschi studied her arch construction before designing his dome in Florence. The great cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore rises on engineering principles learned in sewers. And the men? The tunnel walkers? Their ghosts echo in every modern sanitation worker who descends into darkness before dawn. The speleology who map Rome's underground chambers, they hum the same wordless songs that Cuniculari sang. Different language, same loneliness. Different emperor, same darkness. In 1847, when cholera swept London, Edwin Chadwick read Frontinus and wept. He'd discovered what Rome knew 2 millennia earlier, that disease follows water, that filth kills more surely than swords, that civilization's true measure isn't the height of its monuments, but the depth of its drains. The Great Stink of 1858 finally convinced Parliament. Joseph Bazalgette's intercepting sewers, which still serve London today, follow gradients Agrippa would recognize. New York's aqueduct engineers made pilgrimages to Rome, sketching the Pont du Gard with reverent precision. When they built the Croton system, they carved Roman numerals into the masonry, not from vanity, but from kinship. Waterworkers recognizing waterworkers across the centuries. Even now, in cities that never saw a Roman sandal, the echoes continue. Tokyo's engineers study ancient hydraulics. São Paulo's favela dwellers dig channels using principles old as Tarquin's reign. In refugee camps from Syria to Somalia, men with engineering degrees and calloused hands redirect sewage with the same bitter competence their Roman ancestors knew. The mystery deepens when you realize how much knowledge we've lost. Roman concrete, mixed with volcanic ash from Vesuvius, grows stronger underwater, a secret formula modern engineers still struggle to replicate. Their hydraulic cement sets in conditions that would dissolve our best Portland mixes. We've mapped the human genome, but can't recreate mortar recipes that Vitruvius considered elementary. Medieval Arabs preserved more Roman engineering texts than medieval Europeans. While Charlemagne's scribes illuminated Bibles, scholars in Baghdad translated Heron's Pneumatica and preserved aqueduct manuals that Europe forgot. When the Moors built irrigation channels in Andalusia, they followed Roman surveys. When the Reconquista drove them out, the knowledge scattered, some returning to Europe through Venetian traders, some carried to North Africa, some simply lost. The Renaissance recovery was fragmentary. We have Frontinus on aqueducts, but not on sewers. We know how Romans calculated water pressure, but not how they prevented siphon breaks. We can measure their pipe diameters, but can't replicate their joint sealing techniques. Entire libraries of hydraulic knowledge vanished when the last municipal engineers died, but the stones remember. In Rome's Trastevere district, construction workers still uncover forgotten Roman culverts. The channels run clean, their brickwork intact, their gradients precise. 2,000 years of earthquakes, floods, and siege warfare yet, the water still flows downhill at exactly the angle Agrippa calculated. These discoveries happen monthly now. Rome's subway construction is an archaeological nightmare. Every time they dig, they find another tunnel, another branch of the great underground network. The Metropolitana had to be rerouted 17 times to avoid destroying ancient sewers still in active use. The city lives on two levels: modern Rome walking above, ancient Rome flowing below. Tour groups descend into the San Clemente Basilica, where you can stand in a 12th century church built over a 4th century church built over. A 1st century Mithraeum built over a Republican-era apartment, block built over, always over the eternal whisper of moving water. That's the real triumph. Not the aqueducts tourists photograph, magnificent as they are. Not the Pantheon's dome or the Colosseum's arches. The real Roman miracle is invisible, audible only to those who know how to listen. The sound of waste moving cleanly away from human habitation. The engineering that makes civilization possible. Every time you flush a toilet, you're participating in a 2,000-year-old ritual. Every time a city stays free of cholera. Every time children play in streets that aren't rivers of sewage. Every time fresh water flows from a tap, Rome's tunnel walkers accomplished their mission. They died in darkness so we could live in light. The Cloaca Maxima still breathes, still sighs, still carries the city's secrets to the sea. And somewhere in her depths, carved into brick, the Tarquin slaves laid by lamplight. Names wait in the darkness: tunnel walkers, who traded sunlight for stone, who calculated gradients with their lives, who built the invisible foundation every civilization since has depended on. Their work echoes still. So that's the story, not polished or glorious, but worn, wind-beaten, and real. Not the Rome of marble emperors and golden eagles, but the Rome of mud-caked engineers and tunnel-walking ghosts. The Rome that still flows beneath our feet, carrying away our waste as efficiently as it carried Caesar's, following gradients calculated when the world was young. If you're still with me through these dark hours, thank you for descending into these forgotten depths, for listening to the whispers of men who died before Christ was born, for letting their quiet competence drift across your night. I hope somewhere in the dampness and the mathematics, in the slow drip of ancient stone and the patient flow of hidden water, you found a little peace. These weren't heroes in the traditional sense. No speeches, no statues, no songs. Just men who understood that civilization lives or dies in the space between fresh water coming in and wastewater going out. Who knew that the unglamorous work, the invisible work, matters most? Who built so well that their calculations still govern the cities we live in? 2 millennia after their names were forgotten. Their legacy isn't conquest or glory. It's the simple miracle that when you wake tomorrow morning, turn a handle, and clean water flows, or flip a switch and waste disappears, you re-benefiting from knowledge, earned in tunnels so deep that sunlight never reached the men who dug them. Every modern city is built on Roman bones. Every municipal engineer follows Roman mathematics. Every time a plague doesn't spread through contaminated water, every time a flood doesn't drown the poorest neighborhoods first, the tunnel walkers have won again. If this helped you sleep, if the steady rhythm of ancient water carried you toward rest, please like the video and subscribe if you like more slow journeys through the forgotten corners of history. Let me know where you're re-listening from and whether you made it all the way down to the deepest tunnels with me. I love knowing who else finds peace in these quiet excavations of the past. Tomorrow, we'll wander somewhere new. Maybe to the salt mines beneath Salzburg, where medieval miners carved cathedrals in darkness. Maybe to the ice roads of medieval Novgorod, where merchants traded amber for silver across frozen rivers. Maybe even stranger places, where human persistence created beauty that no one was meant to see. But still slow, true. Still waiting in the darkness for someone to remember. Until then, sleep well. The tunnels are still flowing. The work continues. There are more stories echoing in the stone, and I'll be here to tell them. The Cloaca Maxima sighs goodnight.